So let's talk about triggers. So as we mentioned earlier, right? So triggers are very much like these stored procedures that we've been writing all along. But the difference is that they're meant to be executed when certain events occur, right? Whereas stored procedures are meant to be executed maybe from the command line, right? And I call or I execute a stored procedure, passes some parameters, and does maybe some admin task for us, right? Some cleanup. Whereas the triggers are meant to be executed when certain things happen. Usually the events that we care about is when certain inserts occur or certain updates occur, right? And you want to say, oh, this insert occurred. Let me look at what the data that you're sending me. Is it okay, right? And maybe maybe if I find something that's not quite right, I can clean up some of the data. I can do some pre-processing of the data right before it's actually inserted into a database, right? Also, as mentioned earlier, there's this would allow us to maybe manage some of the inconsistency risks, right? Where if you have some denormalized tables that would cause you to make sure that that where you have to update two tables at the same time, right? Then usually you would do it through a store procedure, right? Where you know that if you insert into a table and you're keeping track of some audit, right? That you want to know, who changed this record, what were the values before and after, and whatnot. Then you might do it in a store procedure. So what you're listening at whatever's whatever's happening with, I don't know, some stock transactions, right? You want to know who the buyer is, what was the original, how much was the stock before and whatnot, right? And how many were there, and you can maybe create a trail, an audit trail, right? Or like before, right? When we did an insert into a student table, and we were keeping track of an alumni table, and now we have this redundancy where a student is now represented in two different places, right? So that's a redundancy that somehow we need to manage. What if I remove the student from one of the tables, right? And I remove it from the student table. Well, then it would be inconsistency to keep it as an alumni in the alumni table, right? I would need to delete it from both places. And that's one of the things we like to avoid, right? When we do an update on some data, if there are no redundancies, usually my inserts, my updates, my deletes would only be a single record, right? Whenever we find ourselves that we need to update or delete or insert into two different tables, that's a clear flag that you have redundancy, right? That there's something is being represented in two different places, and if you forget, right, you might introduce inconsistency where you update one but not the other, right? And things that logically have to be the same somehow start to drift apart, right? My two watches that today I synchronized and logically would have to have the same time, a year from now, maybe they're not, right? Somehow they drifted apart, not because I did anything or whatnot, right? So same thing with data happens, right? Things start to drift apart. So whenever we can remove the possibility of happening, or if we want to make sure that that these things we want to manage those risks, store procedures are usually a really good way of dealing with those kinds of things. So anyway, the syntax is the following. We say trigger, create a trigger, the trigger name, and then you provide a trigger time and a trigger event, right? Which allow you to say, when do you want me to run? When there's an update, when there's an insert, when there's a delete, when do you want me to run? Okay. Also, do you want me to run before or after it occurred? Right? Meaning, if you're inserting something, do you want me to look at the data before it gets inserted, so I can do something before it gets inserted, or after it's inserted, do you want me to look at the results, right, and whatnot, right? Then you can tell it on which table am I listening this event, right? The student table, the alumni table. Who am I listening on? These inserts. Also, you can specify when we delete, right, or when we update. It could be that the update might cause updating many rows, right? And so do you want me to? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to run when the update happens just once, or do you want me to run for every single row that was affected? Okay. So for instance, if I update I run an update, I can either, my logic could be that, well, I don't really care if how many rows there are. I just want to know that there was an update on the table. Okay. I don't care what happened to each individual record. I just want to know that there was an update. Right. So you can say that if you want to buy for row or for the table. Right. But if you want to look at every single row, then you can specify that as well. So you can specify the granularity of the trigger. And then inside of the begin and the end, right, is your logic. What do you want to do, right? And inside of this logic, inside of the begin and end, you are given a before and after look at the row, right? Of saying, what was the row before the insert? Or what was the row before the update? Right? What was the row before, well, not the delete. And then there is an after, right? So you can specify, what was it before, and deciding whether you wanted to let it go through. It says, wait a minute, you're withdrawing from your savings account, and you don't have funds, or you're below your limit, or something, right? So I might stop you. It says, no, you can't do that, right? Or I have a history and says, you've withdrawn 5 times already this today, right? You've reached your limit. I won't let you withdraw more, or whatever. You can run these kinds of logics in here, right? Um, uh, or you're spending, and for every whenever there's a when you're spending, and any decimal portion, I grab that and I put it into your savings account, right? I can run these kinds of things where I can manipulate maybe 2 different tables, right? And I can enforce some savings. So anyway, so here's a little more, and we can now there's also a nice naming convention that we're suggesting, that when you name your trigger, right? A good naming convention is to follow this here. It's a suggestion, right? You first say the trigger time, the table name, and the trigger event, right? With a semicolon in there. So for instance, if your trigger is on the employee table, and you want this trigger to execute before, right? And whenever there's an update, you say, before the employee update, right? So a name would be, right, before underscore employee underscore update, right? Which is easier to read, right? Before the employee update occurs, right? I want you to run this, right? Or you can say after the employee updates, right? Or deletes, or inserts, right? Before and after. Make sense? Right. So that's a good naming convention that perhaps you might want to follow. So imagine we have this employees audit, right? We create a table that we're going to keep track of the employee, the last name, when they were changed, what action was taken on this particular employee. We're keeping track of this audit, right? Specifically, if we want to calculate their retirement, we need to know that maybe they changed departments, from they work from this department to this department from these years, and they went up the chain of command. They left for a couple of years, right? Then they came back and kept working for the state, right? And we want to keep track of this audit, so that we can keep track of their seniority. And at the end of the year, at the end of working 30 years at the state, we can calculate their retirement, based on an audit trail. So this audit trail, we would like to be able to, every time we increase their salary, every time we move them and give them a promotion, blah blah blah, right? We want to keep track of an audit. So we can create a trigger that says, before the employee table is updated, right? So that's the name we chose, right? Before employee update, and the way we specify is before update on employees, right? And this is for each row, meaning we're not going to just look at when the table was updated. We're going to look at every single row that was updated, right? And this is somebody actually ran an update statement, right? Somebody ran an update statement, and if that happens, this triggers, this runs. So when it starts, what we want to do is we want to insert into the audit table. Well, we want to insert something to the audit table. Say what's going on. We want to say the action is going to, the value of the action is going to be update. The employee note. So these are fields in the audit table, right? We're inserting into the audit table, and we can take a look at the employee number. What we can do is that we notice this old here, right? This old, right, is a reference to the record, right, that is being updated, right? It shows, it gives you a reference to the record, how it was before the update, right? Notice that it's running before. This is running before, meaning the update hasn't occurred yet. The update hasn't occurred yet. It's about to occur, but you have digs on this, right? It says, well, what do you want to do before it gets updated? You know, here's the record, right? How it stands right now, right? You can take a look at the values in there. So we can copy over some values from the original record. We'll copy the employee ID. We'll copy maybe the last name, right? To populate our audit table, right? And then we can calculate the change date. You know, when did it occur now, and then we do the insert. Notice that we haven't done to the anything to the actual record, meaning we're letting it go through. You know, so the update will occur. We're just adding an audit right next to it. We could have aborted this. We could say, no. You know, we're not giving everybody a 20% salary increase. Right? Somebody must have thumbed this information wrong. The update was wrong, right? And the trigger says, no, we're aborting the update. No way, right? We could do that as well. Yes. I'm sorry? No, action is a field in the table, in the audit table. Right? In the audit table, action is one of the fields. Oh yeah, no, you could do that. Yes, exactly. You can set the fields on that particular one, and the resulting of that set is what gets actually inserted into the insert. Yep. Mm-hmm. You can also say, well, here's where it was an update. Here's an insert, and so in the insert, what you get now is a reference of the new record that is about to be added to the database, right? Notice in the update, we are basically manipulating records that were already there, but we're changing a couple of things. So old gives you an access to that record that was being updated, whereas new gets access to the record that is about to be inserted, right? It doesn't exist yet in the database, right? Notice that we're also executing instead of before, and before the employee. And so the audit, when we're inserting this, right, we're copying the action. A new record was inserted. We can copy the employee number and the last name to do the audit trail. Okay. Oh, that's all I have.